I looked at Nolan, and Nolan was like shaking his head, laughing, and I was like, "Dude, you crazy?" I was like just joking with him, and but anyway, Nolan. That was the last time I laid eyes on him. But when we were leaving, obviously, no one is getting left at the island that came with us, unless they demanded to, be there and asked. This is a very common thing at Horn Island. When you're out there, a lot of people ride out there with someone and in with somebody else all the time. I've done that 100 times. It's a very common thing. But Nolan was sitting by the boat with that Katie girl, and my buddy yelled for Nolan, get on the boat. We're leaving. The boat's having issues. And no, he didn't say that, but he was panicking. Nolan, get the F on the boat. Get on the boat. And Nolan said, no, I'm staying out here. I'm going to ride in with somebody else. And it's not uncommon to hear, but it's not like my buddy asked him one time. My buddy asked Nolan multiple times to get on the boat. Nolan, get on the boat. Get on the boat. We're leaving. If you're coming, you got to come now. And Nolan made a decision to stay out on the island.
And I heard the girl that he was with, Katie, had text somebody that she heard people yelling
correct
for Nolan to get on. Is that true?
And I have a picture of that. She texted my buddy, and the next day everybody was panicking and everybody's texting Katie, because she was obviously seen with Nolan the whole day at the island. Katie sent a message to my buddy the next day and said, this is the last time I saw him. He's really sweet. But she also mentioned that the last time she saw Nolan was when my buddy was yelling at him to get on the boat.
Somebody counted the boats twice. That's the part that sticks with me. Not the search planes, not the news trucks that showed up later. Just a handful of sunburned, worn-out kids at the tail end of a long holiday, standing in a driveway after dark, counting the same faces again and again, and landing on the same number every time. One short. And you know how a head count goes. You assume you messed it up. Count again. He's probably in the bathroom. He probably grabbed a ride on the other boat. He'll come strolling through that door any second, and we'll all feel dumb for worrying. He didn't come through the door. Here's what you have to understand about the water where this happened. In the daytime, it's basically a block party. Coolers, music, a couple hundred people standing around in water that barely hits their chest. Looks about as threatening as a backyard pool. But there's a spot where the sandbar just quits. One more step and the floor is gone, and you're in 20-odd feet of it with something dragging you sideways that you cannot see and cannot outswim. And by evening, that drag gets meaner, because the whole ocean is slowly pulling itself back out. The people who live there know exactly where that line sits. Everybody else finds it the hard way. And he was somewhere in between. Not a local, not a stranger. Just a young man having a completely ordinary good day, surrounded by people who loved him. So when he turned up missing that night, the move was obvious. Call the girl he'd been hanging around, the one everyone figured he'd gone with. And that call is the exact moment this stops being a story about a missed ride. Because she said she hadn't seen him. She was already home. He never came with her. As it turns out, he never went with anybody. And that's the hole in the center of all of this that nobody's managed to fill. Before we go any further, we're going to talk about the death of a young man, about autopsy findings that don't add up, and about details that are genuinely hard to hear. If today's not the day for that, that's more than okay. It'll be right here when you're ready. If you're new here, welcome. Hit subscribe and stay with me, because this one turns in a direction you're not expecting. This is the crime executioner. That morning, the group set out the way they had before. Several boats crossed the water together toward the island, part of a much larger crowd drawn out for the holiday. Hundreds of people were already there by the time they arrived. Coolers came off the boats. Music carried across the sand. It was, by every account, an ordinary 4th of July. Like a lot of people out there that day, Nolan had been drinking. That detail matters later, so it is worth stating plainly and moving on. Friends would recall seeing him in good spirits through the early afternoon, moving between groups, talking, laughing. The last confirmed sightings put him on the island somewhere in the mid-afternoon hours. After that, the accounts begin to thin. Then one of the boats ran into trouble. It started taking on water, and the situation turned urgent enough that the group needed to head back to the mainland right away. This is the moment the day pivots. As they prepared to leave, Nolan was not on board. According to a friend who was there, Javon Williams among them, Nolan chose to stay behind.
Nolan was sitting by the boat with that Katie girl, and my buddy yelled for Nolan, get on the boat. We're leaving. The boat's having issues. And like, no, he didn't say that, but he was panicking. Nolan, get the F on the boat. Get on the boat. And Nolan said, no, I'm staying out here. I'm going to ride in with somebody else.
The reason offered was that he had met a girl and intended to ride back later on someone else's boat. Trading rides like that was common out here, so at the time, it raised no alarm. But that explanation has never fully settled. Others close to the case have questioned whether it happened the way it was described, and investigators have treated the afternoon as something still to be established rather than a settled fact. What is certain is narrow. The boats left, and Nolan Wells stayed on that island. For a while, nobody was worried. That is the part that's hard to explain to people who weren't there. When you leave an island in a group that size, you don't do a formal count. You assume everyone found a way back. Nolan had said he'd catch another boat, and so as far as anyone knew, he had. The group made it back to the mainland and regrouped at a house, the way they'd planned all along. People were tired, sunburned, winding down from a long day. And at some point, someone finally asked the question that should have been simple to answer. Where was Nolan? The assumption was easy enough. He'd left with the girl he'd stayed behind to talk to. Someone would just reach out and confirm it. So they did. And that is where the day quietly falls apart. Because when they reached her, she told them something no one expected. He had never come with her. She had gone back on her own. Whatever plan Nolan described on that beach, it had not happened. He hadn't ridden in with her, and now that they were asking, no one could say who he had ridden in with at all. If you find yourself needing to know how a healthy young man vanishes in front of a crowd, that instinct is exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe and follow it with me, because the answer only gets stranger from here. By the time the pieces lined up, the truth was stark. There was no other boat. There was no ride waiting for him. Nolan Wells was still out there, and no one had actually seen him leave. The call that changes everything came late that night. When it became clear that no one could account for Nolan, his mother, Christine Wansley, reported him missing. Somewhere on that dark stretch of water, or on the island itself, her son was unaccounted for, and there was nothing to do but wait and hope the phone would ring with better news. A search launched in response. The Coast Guard was brought in. State Marine Resources officers put boats on the water. Aircraft went up to cover ground that boats alone couldn't, sweeping the shoreline and the channels around the island from above. A volunteer group, the United Cajun Navy, joined the effort by air as well, adding eyes to a search area that was vast, open, and unforgiving after dark. Think about what that night asked of the people involved. A barrier island with no lights, no facilities, no easy way to move across it quickly. Water that stretched for miles in every direction. And a family on the mainland refreshing their phones, telling themselves the most hopeful version of events for as long as they could hold on to it. His father, Elmore Wansley, would later put the weight of it into a single, plain sentence. He said his son should be at football practice, not buried in the ground. There is no need to dress that up. It says exactly what a parent feels when the ordinary future they assumed for their child is taken away without explanation. The search stretched on, and for a day, the answer stayed just out of reach. The waiting ended on the morning of July 6. 2 days after Nolan was last seen, a U.S. park ranger came upon his body in the water near the northwestern tip of the island. The search that everyone had hoped would end with relief ended instead with the news his family had been dreading. There is a version of this moment that other tellings would linger on. This one won't. What matters is not the condition of the scene, but the questions it raised, and those questions started immediately. The Jackson County coroner, Bruce Lind, examined the body and noted something significant in its restraint. There were no immediate, obvious signs of injury, nothing on the surface that pointed clearly to how a strong young athlete had ended up in that water and never come out. And that single observation is what turned a tragedy into a mystery. A missing person had been found, but being found answered almost nothing. The far harder question, the one that would consume everything that followed, was only beginning. What actually happened to Nolan Wells? The official response came quickly, and it set the tone for everything that followed. Within a day of the body being found, the Jackson County Sheriff, John Ledbetter, told the public that no foul play had been identified. Investigators, he said, were interviewing the people who had first-hand contact with Nolan that day. Their working theory leaned toward an accident. They suspected he had drowned. On July 7th, the state took formal custody of the questions. The Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office conducted the official autopsy. But answers would not come fast. Toxicology testing, the standard analysis that shows what was in a person's system, takes time, often weeks or months. Until those results returned, there would be no official cause of death, only that early, cautious lean toward drowning. To a lot of people, that explanation was reasonable. The waters around the island are known to be dangerous. Alcohol had been part of the day. On its face, a tired swimmer in rough water is a tragedy that sadly happens. But it did not sit right with the people who knew Nolan best. And their objection was not emotion. It was specific. Nolan could swim. He was an athlete, and his own father would insist that his son was fully capable in the water. To the family, he probably drowned was not a conclusion. It was an assumption reached before the evidence was in. That gap, between what officials were prepared to accept early and what the family refused to accept at all, is where this case cracks open. They were not going to wait quietly for a report that might take months. They were going to push. And so they did. Faced with a theory they couldn't accept and a timeline they couldn't control, the family made a decision that changed the scale of the case entirely. They brought in Ben Crump. If you follow these stories, you know the name. Crump is a civil rights attorney whose involvement tends to signal that a family believes they are not getting the full truth from local authorities. Alongside him came Reverend Al Sharpton. Their stated reason for stepping in was direct. They pointed to contradictions in the account of what happened, and to a silence from investigators that the family found impossible to sit with. The mother would say the last real contact she'd had from the sheriff's office came only a day or two after the body was found. Their entrance did something else too. It pulled a local tragedy onto a national stage, and it named out loud a dimension that had been building underneath the case from the start. Nolan was black. He had been part of a friend group that was largely white, in a Mississippi town where the history of race is neither distant nor abstract. Online, images of him among that group had already become a flashpoint, read by some as a warning sign, and by others as nothing of the kind. It is important to be careful here. That racial dimension is a documented part of this story and the national conversation around it. It is not, on its own, evidence of what happened. Both things are true at once. If the family wanted an answer the official process wasn't giving them, they would have to go get one. So they commissioned a second autopsy, privately funded, and they brought in a heavyweight to perform it. The doctor was Roger A. Mitchell Jr. His credentials are worth stating, because they're the reason his findings carried weight. He is a board-certified forensic pathologist, the president of the National Medical Association, and the former chief medical examiner for Washington, D.C. This was not a second opinion from someone on the margins. It was one of the most respected voices in the field. He conducted his examination on July 10th, 4 days after the body was found. When the preliminary results were announced, they did not deliver the clarity everyone wanted. Mitchell's conclusion on the central question was that the cause and manner of death were undetermined, pending investigation. But inside that non-answer were details that made the case more unsettling, not less. He documented an area of red discoloration in the soft tissue at the back of the head. He was careful about what that meant, because on its own it could mean more than one thing. It could be a change caused by the body's condition, or it could point to an injury. The report did not resolve which, and it did not claim to. What he did not find is just as important. There were no fractures, no lacerations, no deep tissue injuries across the body that would tell a clear story of violence. And there was a limitation he flagged plainly. Certain internal neck structures had been retained by the state during the first autopsy, so he never received them. He could not examine what he did not have. Then came the line that reframed the entire case. Mitchell wrote that he could not rule out that some non-accidental factor had contributed to Nolan's death. That sentence is the reason we can't wrap this up neatly, and it's exactly where careful analysis matters more than a hot take. If that's the kind of coverage you want, subscribe, because two forensic experts are about to look at that same finding and land in completely different places. Undetermined is not the same as accidental. It is not the same as foul play either. It is the sound of a case still open, with a body that had answered some questions and quietly raised harder ones. Here is where this case stops being simple to narrate, because the same piece of evidence pulls two qualified experts in opposite directions. That red mark at the back of the head became the thing everyone had to interpret, and interpretation, it turns out, is where the disagreement lives. On one side is Michael Baden. If you've watched enough of these cases, you've heard the name. He is one of the most prominent forensic pathologists in the country, a veteran of some of the highest profile death investigations of the last several decades. Asked about the finding, his read was measured and, for the family, deflating. In his assessment, that discoloration did not point to foul play. It was not, to him, the signature of someone striking a fatal blow. On the other side stands Kendall Von Crowns, a chief medical examiner in Texas who was not part of the case but was asked to weigh in. His view kept the door open. That same discoloration, he explained, genuinely could be one of two very different things. It could be a change brought on by the body's condition after time in the water, or it could be the result of blunt force to the back of the head and neck. He wasn't asserting violence, he was refusing to rule it out. And that is the honest, uncomfortable center of this entire story. Not a cover-up, not a smoking gun, just a genuine limit to what the evidence as it stands can prove. Two experienced professionals looking at the same finding, reasoning carefully, and arriving at conclusions that don't line up. For a viewer, the temptation is to pick the version that feels right and treat it as settled. But that's not what the evidence supports, and pretending otherwise would be doing exactly what the family has asked people to stop doing. The mark on the back of Nolan's head is real. What it means is unresolved. Both of those statements are true, and for now, neither expert can turn the maybe into a certainty. Some of the confusion in this case didn't come from the evidence, it came from the words used to describe it, and one phrase in particular sent people spiraling. At one point it was said publicly that Nolan had been found fully clothed. To anyone following along, that landed like a clue. He'd been seen shirtless earlier in the day, so if he turned up fully dressed, the obvious question was how, and who put those clothes on him. Theories built themselves in real time. The trouble is, that's not what was meant. Leaders from the volunteer group that helped search, the United Cajun Navy, walked it back. Their president, Todd Terrell, and their vice president, Brian Trasher, clarified what had actually been observed. Nolan was found wearing swim trunks, and only swim trunks. Seen from the air, at a distance, the body had simply appeared more dressed than it was. Fully clothed wasn't a finding. It was a phrase that got away from the person who said it. This is worth slowing down on, because it's the whole case in miniature. A vague description becomes a certainty online before anyone checks it. Trasher also spoke to the water itself. He described the currents in that area in blunt terms, likening them to a washing machine, the kind of churn that can overwhelm even a capable swimmer. That detail, unlike the clothing, was real swimmer. By this point, the case had split into two arguments happening at once. There was the question of how Nolan died, and there was a second, louder question. Was anyone competent handling the first one? That second fight came to a head publicly. The president of the knockup, Derek Johnson, leveled a hard accusation at local investigators. His word for their handling of the case was derelict. The charge wasn't that they had reached the wrong conclusion. It was that they hadn't done the work, hadn't followed up the way a death like this demanded. The district attorney pushed back. Angel Myers-McElrath, who oversees the case, defended both the pace and the integrity of the investigation. Her argument was essentially this: speed and thoroughness are not the same thing, and rushing to satisfy public pressure would risk the very outcome everyone claimed to want. She said the case was being treated as a priority and handled with the same care given to any death investigation. She also explained where it was headed. The case would go before a grand jury. That part sounds dramatic, but she was clear that it isn't unusual here. In that county, nearly every death that isn't plainly natural or a routine accident goes to a grand jury as a matter of standard procedure. It's not proof of a crime. It's the process working the way it always does. Underneath the public argument, actual investigative work was ongoing, and this is the part worth holding on to. Investigators had interviewed roughly 60 witnesses. The friends who had been on the boat with Nolan were questioned in depth, and federal help had been brought in, with the FBI assisting on the digital side of the evidence. Whatever you make of the finger-pointing, that detail matters. This was not a file-gathering dust. It was an open, active investigation, still moving, still pulling in resources, still unfinished. By now, this was no longer a local story, and the names attaching themselves to it made that unmistakable. What had started as a family's private grief on the Mississippi coast had drawn the attention of some of the most recognizable figures in the country. The independent autopsy, the second examination that reframed so much of this case, had been privately funded, and the person who paid for it was Colin Kaepernick. The former quarterback turned activist stepped in to cover a cost the family otherwise would have carried alone. The filmmaker Tyler Perry took on another burden, covering the funeral expenses so the family could lay their son to rest without that weight. And there was a reward. Reverend Al Sharpton, Tyler Perry, and former NFL star Terrell Owens together put up a combined sum of $125,000. The condition attached to it was precise, and worth noting. The money was offered for information leading to an arrest and conviction if a crime had in fact occurred. Even the reward acknowledged the open question at the center of everything. So strip away the noise, the theories, the online arguments, and look only at what the evidence can actually carry. When you do, you find two honest columns, and neither one is empty. Start with the case for an accident, because it is stronger than the internet often admits. The waters around that island are genuinely dangerous, described by people who search them as capable of pulling down even a strong swimmer. Alcohol was part of the day, and alcohol and open water are a well-documented deadly combination regardless of how well someone swims. And critically, the examination that was done found no fractures, no lacerations, no deep tissue injuries, none of the physical signatures you would expect if someone had been beaten or overpowered. A capable swimmer can still drown. It happens more often than people want to believe. Now the other column, because it is not empty either. There is that area of red discoloration at the back of the head, real, documented, and unexplained, sitting in that uncomfortable space, where it might be nothing or might be something. There is the gap in the evidence itself, the internal neck structures that were retained by the state and never examined by the independent pathologist, which means a region of the body that can matter a great deal in a death like this was never fully assessed by both sides. And there is the single most important sentence in any of the findings. The pathologist would not rule out that a non-accidental factor played a role. Here is the discipline this case demands. You cannot take the accident column and call it proof, and you cannot take the open questions and call them a crime. Both would be dishonest, and both are exactly what has flooded this story from the beginning. What the evidence supports right now is uncertainty. Real, unresolved, frustrating uncertainty. Not a cover-up you can name, not a killer you can point to, and not a clean accident you can sign off on and forget. The honest answer is that we do not yet know, and that the pieces we have do not fit into any single conclusion cleanly enough to close. Go back to that driveway one more time. The end of a long holiday, a group of tired kids, a head count that kept coming up one short. At the time, it felt like a mistake someone had made. We know now it wasn't. It was the first sign of a question that still doesn't have an answer. Everything since has circled that same empty space. 2 autopsies, and no cause of death. Experts who can't agree. A phrase that spun into a theory. A national spotlight, and $100,000 on the table for a crime no one can yet prove happened. There is still more to come. The state's official autopsy remains sealed, waiting on a grand jury review that could reshape everything we think we understand. If you want to be here when that lands, subscribe and stay with it, because this story isn't finished. But strip all of it back, and what remains is the thing Nolan's family has asked for from the very beginning. Not a headline, not a verdict handed to them by strangers online, just the truth about what happened to their son. They deserve that answer, and so did he.